Okay, glad to have you all to this English class. My dear class 10 students, we have been doing a lot of topics, and today from the poetry section we will be doing a poem, that is The Wind Hover. For class 10 syllabus, we have already discussed that there are only 4 poems, and here today the poem that we are doing is, as mentioned, The Wind Hover. You will find The Wind Hover in page number 120 to 123. The poem itself is a short poem, but anything related to the poem will be found in between page number 120 to 123. Okay, The Wind Hover is a sonnet. We know the different types of poems, right? We have the ballads, we have sonnets, we have different kinds of poems, and today The Wind Hover is a sonnet. If you do not know what a sonnet is a 14-lined poem, and it will normally consist of 8 lines rhyming similarly or rhyming together. We call that as an octet, and another 6 lines that follows it will be in another rhyming scheme, and that is the sestet, we call it. Okay, and so this is what The Wind Hover is. We will now discuss about the poet. You know who is a poet? Because from your lower classes in your English class, you have been reading about poets and writers. The difference between a poet and an author is, a poet is a person who writes poems, and authors can be the writer of any book or any kind of stories. Okay, and so our poet here is Gerard Manley Hopkins. I repeat, Gerard Manley Hopkins. He is considered, and he was considered to be one of the greatest poets of the Victorian era. Okay, you know, literature has different kinds of eras. When I say Victorian era, it does not necessarily have to be during the time when Queen Victoria reigned, but there are certain ages given for the literature, and so he was considered one of the greatest poet and the greatest writer of Victorian era. He was born in the year 1844 and died in the year 1889. Okay, I repeat, born in the year 1844 and died in 1889. He had been writing, and after some years he decided to join the novitiate. You know, a novitiate is a theological college for the Catholics. We have heard of that, right? So he joined one of the novitiate, and after joining the novitiate, what did he do? He decided to burn all his writings that he had accumulated. He might have written a lot of things, but after joining the novitiate, what he did was he burned everything, and he decided to follow only what his superiors said. He decided to follow only what the persons above him tells him to do so. He dedicated his whole life to the ministry of the church, and that is the reason why he decided not to do anything on his own, because he might have felt that thing would have gone wrong if he was just following his mind, and so he decided to follow only what the superiors will instruct him. That is what he had been doing, and later on he became a priest. Okay, he became a priest. Later on you will find that this poem that we are doing right now is also about Christ. We will discuss that later. So he became a priest, but you might be wondering, if all his writings were burnt, how could a poem like The Wind Hover could be published again? It is because he had a friend who is also a poet, okay, Robert Bridges. His friend began to publish his poems after his death. Remember, none of the works of Gerard Manley Hopkins were published during his lifetime. But after his death, one of his friends, who was also a poet named Robert Bridges, published his writings. And then this was all because of the effort that his friend gave. His friend might have thought that his friend might have regretted to let a good work like the work of this poet to go unnoticed by the world. And so later on, when his works were published, people began to see the quality that he had in his writing, which was not known when he was still alive, because he himself decided to stop and decided to cover up his works, because he might have thought that these are not worthy, and that is the reason why he began to cover up. He began to burn away the writings that he had. Okay, as I've told you, the type of poetry, it is a sonnet we have also discussed the rhyming scheme. If you see the rhyming scheme, that means I've told you how it will be. You always have to take the last syllable or the last word in each line. So you will find that all the 8 lines, the last words of the 8 lines will all sound similar. That means they have the octet. And the following 6 lines will have a different rhyming scheme, which is also called the sestet. So that is about the poem, the system that the poet had written. And in the poem, the poet discusses about the qualities that he sees. And this poem is a poem dedicated to Christ our Lord. As the beginning of the poem starts with that, we see that he had attributed all the glory that he sees in the bird and he has attributed all those qualities and compared it to the sacrifices that Jesus had made for all of us. As Christians, I don't have to be discussing about all these things again. We know the sacrifices we have been discussing, but since this is a secular topic, I will not be dealing with that. Okay? Now, the wind hover, you might have heard of what a wind hover is, but in case, if there is anyone who still needs to know the wind hover, it is a bird from the falcon family. We all have been hearing of Amur falcon in Nagaland, which is also quite popular. And in simple terms, we might also use in this way, it is from the eagle family. Though literally it is said that it's from the falcon family, but eagle becomes a common term for us, so let's take it that way. The wind hover is a bird from the family of the eagle, and the poet sees the qualities that this bird has. Sometimes we do not notice the qualities of something which is always around us. For example, if we see a flower blooming ordinarily on the streets, maybe we do not notice it. But when it is kept properly by a florist, we see the quality and the price that it has. So the same thing the poet wants to convey to us. We will be able to see the qualities and the goodness of something only when we give our full concentration in it. And this is exactly what we will be seeing in this poem. The poet says that the way that the wind hover flies, it hovers around. It does not flap its wings. It just flies very swiftly, and he compares this to a shoveler. Shoveler is also called a knight. You know who is a knight, right? In the present day, we do not consider the knight in very common terms, but when you read stories from the earlier years, you will see the qualities of a knight. And a knight is usually a person who fights for the evils in the societies. It can also be compared to the modern day police forces. It may not be exactly similar, but this is what the poet has brought in. He brought in some words which may not necessarily relate to the bird itself. So he says that the quality of the wind hover is like a knight. He also says that it is like the rider, a horse rider. You might have admired the horse rider a lot of times in the movies that you watch, and you would also want to become like them. You envy them sometimes, isn't it? And he says that the bird flies very swiftly, and when you look from behind or when you look from far away, what you notice is the movement is almost like a horse rider. It comes very swiftly, and it is also almost like a scatter. You know, when you scat, you just take swift turns, and that is what exactly the bird was doing. Okay, and here he starts the poem by saying that in the morning he caught a morning minion. That means the darling of the morning. He considers the bird to be a precious one. And he also compared the bird to the prince of kingdom daylight. Okay, if you go through the poem, you will see daylight's dolphin. Those are some words which are not very common in our daily use. But this simply means that the bird is almost like a prince. Everybody knows a prince is the son of a king, and so he says that it is almost like a prince, that the qualities that he bears are always incomparable. Brute, beauty, and valor. Those are some words used by the poet so beautifully. Brute literally means something which is fierce or something which is cruel. And how can you bring the word brute and beauty together, right? Brute is in total contrast in our literal use. It is something in total contrast to beauty. But he brought these two together. And even in our daily lives, if we use these two combinations carefully, it becomes a very beautiful thing. You can be fierce in the things which are not good for you. Even in your daily characters, maybe your friends are influencing you to join something which is not good. In those areas you can be a brute person, but you can also have beauty together in it. The beauty of rejecting what is evil and what is wrong for us can also be compared to the bird here. The poet brought these words together to let us know and appreciate the qualities that the windhover has in it. He says that the bird comes flying very swiftly, and we know that an eagle flies higher than the rest of the bird, and the way it flies needs a lot of concentration. According to us, the bird may not necessarily be needing this, but when we see the bird flying around with the swiftness and without flapping their wings, you know what is flapping, right? Most of the birds flap their wings after a few moments or after a few minutes, but you see the eagle will just slide. It's as if he is sliding down. And these are the qualities that and when the poet sees the bird, you know, the neck part or the chest part, the color is a little reddish in color. And when he saw this, he also found that it reminds him of the sacrifice that Christ has made for all of us. In the later part of the poem, we see in the last lines, the poet uses blood and vermilion. All those are in relation to the sacrifices that Christ had given his life for all of us. And we don't see all these things in a normal way, right? In a usual day, you see a bird flying, and that just become a very common sight for you. But the poet also wants to teach us that you can always find something interesting and the preciousness that nature gives around us. It might not necessarily be the bird, the windhover alone, but he says that nature has a lot of things to teach us, and there is always something extraordinarily special if you look at it from a positive point of view. And this can be applied even in our daily lives. You might be having a very close friend. You consider that friend to be just an ordinary friend, maybe, even if you don't look down on that person. You don't consider him to be anything extra special, but when you keep studying him in a positive way, when you try to criticize things in a positive way, you will find that there are so many amazing things that you will find in that friend whom you consider to be an ordinary person like you. The same thing can be found in the bird. And so, but what the poet wants to let us know even from this, not only to appreciate nature, but he also wants us to know that no matter how beautiful a thing may be, everything pales in comparison to the sacrifices that Christ had done for us. I want you to remember that he was a priest. Okay, and most probably most of his writings will be related to religion, since he was a priest. And so he says that though he was looking at the bird in full awe, he was looking at it in surprise, and then he was wondering how a bird, how a creature in nature could be so specially designed. And this was also a creation of God himself. And he kept wondering at the qualities, the skills of the bird, I want you to look at it, the skills that he had. And even as you listen along with me, I want you to imagine the qualities that this bird has. I'm sure you all have seen an eagle, a windhover flying around, a falcon flying around, and you see the quality. It is very different from the other birds that you see daily. And he says that all these are the creation of God, which is incomparable to the works of human beings. And we have to realize it. And he also mentioned that even though the bird is flying very magnificently, like a horse rider, like a scatter, of course all these things are beautiful, but it still pales. That means, you know what is pale? P-A-L-E. The word pale means even though the bird has a lot of qualities, those becomes meaningless, or maybe it loses its quality when it is compared to the sacrifice that Jesus had done for each and every one of us. That is the poem about the wind hover. You can still go on. And then the figures of speech. You have heard of the figure of speech, right? We have discussed about metaphor, we have discussed about simile, and so on. And today I will not be explaining everything, but when you look at the first line of the poem, you will see that there is an alliteration, and I'm going to explain the word alliteration. Okay, alliteration is a word, or are words which has the same letter in almost every word. Why? Because I got this morning's minion. You see the letter M repeating a lot of time. Even in one single line, that is the first line of the poem, you see the word M making a lot of repetitions. And that is called the alliteration. And if you look at his work, you find that he had written the rhyming scheme so beautifully, and also you will find that the alliterations used by him without altering the quality of the poem. And this shows that he was really such a great poet. We think that anyone can write, but when you literally try to put all these figures of speech together in one single writing, you will find that it's also very difficult once you really put into practice. Try writing a poem for a day. Maybe you will even need a week to change it again and again. We make a lot of editings, right? And so you will find that it's difficult, but when we look at this kind of work, you see how beautifully the figures of speech are used. I will not be discussing about the others. You try to read it and do some self-study, but just the first line itself gives us a very beautiful figure of speech that is alliteration without altering the beauty of the poem. This is what we see. And the last thing that I want to discuss is the theme of the poem. I've touched that a little bit, but the main theme of the poem here is to appreciate the beauty of nature in the form of a bird. And he does not only mean the bird here. Of course, he was describing the beauty and the skills that the eagle had, that the wind hover had in it, but he is also trying to let us appreciate the beauty of the so-called ordinary things around us. And once you learn to do that, you will find that even the simplest of things that you consider ordinary will become very beautiful if you really make a proper study about it. This is all about the poem called The Wind Hover. I will just give you a quick recap of what we have discussed, and then we will wind up for today. The first thing that we discussed about is the wind hover. The wind hover, which is also a family of the falcon bird or the eagle for our easy understanding. You will find that in page number 120 to 123. I want you to remember the poem is just 2 pages, but you will find the explanations in page number 122 and 123. And you will also find the questions, which you will find it very easy after listening to the explanation to solve the answers by yourself. And we have discussed about the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, who was considered to be the greatest poet in the Victorian era, and he later on became a priest. His works were published by his friend Robert Bridges only after his death. And the poem The Wind Hover is a sonnet which consists of 14 lines. The first 8 lines are called the octet, and the following 6 lines will be the sestet. And we have discussed about the skills of the bird and how the poet wonders at the skills that this bird possesses. And we have also discussed about the figures of speech, and the example is alliteration. And the main theme is the beauty of nature that you see around us. So I'm sure this will make a meaningful understanding for you all. Please try to follow up in the following classes too. And I want to say thank you for bearing with me so patiently. We will see you next class.